My name's Bob Darrell, and I am alcoholic. And through the grace and power of a very loving God who's absolutely crazy about me and has no taste at all, a dedicated and active home group, a set of principles that were set down, given by God to Bill Wilson and set down in the big book, and a whole lot of newcomers. I've been sober and without any funny cigarettes or anything else since the end of October 1978. And I'm a very, very lucky man. I'd like to thank Alan for picking me up at the airport and for that joke. And I'd like to thank Paul and Dee and the members of the committee for the privilege of coming down here and sharing with you a little bit of what was given to me so graciously in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm really looking forward to this weekend. I didn't know that it started earlier. I would have come in earlier. I missed the two speakers this afternoon, and I'm going to get their tapes. And I missed Evelyn's Old Timers meeting last night. I would have really liked to be there. I know it didn't last more than an hour because she's got this condition, and she can't go. But I'm sure it was a powerful meeting. And I'm just, not to embarrass you, but I always like to know, how many people are in their first year of sobriety here? Did you raise your hand? Okay. Thank you. I really want to welcome you. I'm real glad you're here. As a matter of fact, I'm probably more glad you're here than you are. Coming to Alcoholics Anonymous for guys like me, if you're anything like me, is such a terrible thing. It's like, well, we don't come here when our lives are going good. And I came into Alcoholics Anonymous back in Pennsylvania a long time ago, and I was a newcomer for several years, and I used to hate being a newcomer because they would always ask me to stand up and say my name and say I'm new in the program and I'm an alcoholic, and it seemed like everybody in the room would just turn and look at me, right? And it's at a time in my life I don't want anybody to even know I exist. I feel awful, and I get the feeling like they're saying, this guy down here, this real loser, let's have him stand up so we can all look at him and be grateful we're not him, you know? Now, that's not what they were doing. They wanted me to stand up so they could get to know me and they could reach their hand out to me and make me feel welcome. But I was so sensitive and I felt so uncomfortable. And if you're new, I got to tell you, I'm glad you're here. And I'm glad you're here not because of the stuff that you went through that brought you here. That's horrible stuff. But I'm glad that you're here because if you have the same disease that I have and you're stuck like I was stuck in these rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, you can find a way out of the trap. And that is a glorious thing. And I want that from the bottom of my heart from anybody who suffers like I suffered with alcoholism. We're very fortunate people. And if you're new, don't judge Alcoholics Anonymous on what you hear tonight. Go to some more meetings. Go to a lot of meetings and get a sponsor and get into the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. If you judge Alcoholics Anonymous on what you hear by a few statements in a meeting, you'll get an incomplete picture of Alcoholics Anonymous because it's much more than this. And if you do that, you'll come to a wrong conclusion or you'll be confused about what we really are. It's kind of like the story. There's a not very well-known story about Neil Armstrong, who was an astronaut. And it wasn't published, and I found out about it through a friend of mine that used to work for NASA. And Neil Armstrong was the first man to set foot on the moon. And the writers for the Space Administration had wrote this speech that he was supposed to say when he landed on the moon. And he got off the lunar landing module or whatever it is, and he set foot on the moon, and he says the speech, and the speech was, one small step for man, one giant step for mankind. Then he said, good luck, Mr. Dorsky. And Nassau went crazy. Dorsky, what's this? The CIA's monitoring. They cut it out of the broadcast. The CIA's running it through their computers, trying to find out some kind of code. They don't know what the heck's going on. They wait. They say, we'll have to wait. He splashes down. They fly him to Houston to a debriefing. He's in there with the CIA, and the head of NASA's a friend of his, and he holds everybody off, and he says, Neil, what's going on? Is this some kind of code? Is this a mistake? What's this good luck, Mr. Dorsky? You're supposed to stay one small step for man, one giant step for mankind. And Neil says, no, don't worry, it's nothing. You see, when I was a young kid, I was playing baseball in the backyard, and I hit the ball over the fence into the neighbor's yard, and I climbed over the fence to get the ball. And out of this window, I heard Mrs. Dorsky say, the day I give you a head will be the day the little boy next door walks on the moon. So if you're new, don't judge Alcoholics Anonymous by what you hear tonight. You may not have all the information. And stick around until you know who Mr. Dorsky is. I came to Alcoholics Anonymous as a young kid. I started drinking when I was 12 years old, and I was an alcoholic from the very beginning. I must have been like a freeze-dried alcoholic waiting for alcohol. From the first time I ever took a drink, there was something wrong. And yet, I am the guy they talk about in the big book in chapter 3 when it says most of us have been unwilling to admit we were real alcoholics. There's something about this disease that doesn't want me to have it, that keeps telling me I don't have it, that there's nothing wrong with me, that the problem is really out here. And it's the only disease I know of that uses the person who has the disease's own mind against them. And I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, and my head would work overtime telling me that I'm not quite like you, that I'm different, that I'm special. I have an alcohol problem, but I'm different from you people. And some of the ammunition that my mind used to separate me from you was the fact that I was real young. I went to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, I was 20 years old. Now, unlike today, and back in those days, there wasn't a lot of young people in Alcoholics Anonymous. And they sent me to a young people's group, and there were people in that group that were 30 to 40 years old. I mean, I knew why they stopped drinking. Their life was over. Right? But I'm a young guy. And I looked at them, and I get this feeling like I'm not like you. And another thing, I grew up in the late 60s and early 70s, and if you grew up at that time, and you were a real alcoholic like me, and you ran with the people that I ran with, we were chemically well-balanced people. And I never heard people talk about that in Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's not that I'm not a real alcoholic. I'm the guy they talk about in the book, but I grew up at a time when that was just part of the deal. And I was the kind of guy that if you invited me into your house, I would ask to use the bathroom, and I'd close the door and go through your medicine cabinet and just take whatever's there. I don't even know what it is. Sometimes I'd be awake for days, just talking, saying the same thing over and over again. Other times I'd be falling all over and staggering. Sometimes I got real regular. I bet you I took enough of those wheels, there's no chance I'm going to be pregnant this century. And I would point inside myself, I would look at that and say, I'm special, I'm different, I'm not quite like you. I'm a unique case. And another thing that really had a hard time with in Alcoholics Anonymous is I'd hear people talk about God. And I was raised a Catholic, and Catholicism is not the problem. But I don't know how to say this. I suspect that looking back that there was something wrong with the receiver, because I don't believe that I heard the same things as a child from the priests and nuns that the other kids heard. And the reason I'm convinced of that is that if the other kids had internalized and heard what I thought I heard, they would have quit Catholicism years ago, and most of them are still Catholics. But I'm the kind of guy that I'll hear about the glass of water being half empty rather than half full. And because of that peculiar predisposition to alcoholic thinking, I heard about a God who existed to judge me. He had these sets of rules, that things that I have to do, and these things that I'm not supposed to do. He could see in the dark, which is not a good deal for me. He knew what I was thinking. And even if I'm good enough not to do the things I'm not supposed to do, if I thought about doing them, I'm screwed. And they told me that I was about this place called hell for people who were always out of line, and that he sent you to hell, and it's forever, and you never get out, and they burn you and torture you, and it's awful, and it's just awful. And then they told me about a place for guys, especially like me, if I'm really sorry and ashamed of myself, I can go to this place called purgatory. And it's just like hell. It's awful, and they burn you and torture you, but it only lasts for a couple 100 million years. Now, I got to be about 12 years old. Now, I don't want to offend anybody, but I discovered masturbation, and I could picture a meter in heaven kicking off the millions of years, you know. And I haven't even done anything yet. I'm just practicing. So I made a decision when I'm a young kid that, my God, there just can't be a God. There can't be. I'm never going to be good enough. I'm not enough. I felt always guilty. And so I took a course to prove to myself over and over again that there wasn't. But I am the guy that they talk about in the book, and it says there's a statement in there that deep down inside of every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. And I can't escape that. And it is part and parcel of who and what I am. And even though I denied it to myself, there was always a part of me that was searching for something. And I came into Alcoholics Anonymous with those kind of defense mechanisms, and when people talked about God, I knew that this wasn't for me. I remember going to a meeting, and I was on a geographic running from the police and a bunch of people I owed money to and stuff, and I was up in Maine, and I was incarcerated briefly up there, and there was a prison group that came into the place I was in. They were trustees, and they had a speaker, and I remember listening to him, and he was a big guy, about 260 pounds, with long hair and tattoos all over him. And he was there he'd been arrested, he's been in prison for murder, and he's just a kind of a man's kind of man. You know, the kind of guy you look at and you think, God, I'd like to drink with him. I'd show those guys. Me and him would grip it up, you know. And I'm listening to him, and he has a great story, a lot of things I could identify with. And then he starts talking about God. And I think to myself, oh, what have they done to him? What have they done to him? I mean, it's like, I knew a guy that I used to drink with, and we used to get in trouble together, and I didn't see him for a long time, and I ran into him one time, and his hair was cut short, and he had a suit on, and he had a Bible under his arm, and he was a born-again something, and he was trying to save me, and I'm on my way to get a bottle of wine in the morning. That's the last thing I wanted to be. And I remember him so vividly trying to preach to me and trying to help me. And inside myself saying to myself, I would rather die than be like that. So those are the kind of attitudes that I came into Alcoholics Anonymous with. And I sat in meetings, and everybody seemed to believe in God. And everybody seemed to be real comfortable with that. And I thought there's something wrong with me. I didn't know that there's a whole chapter in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous for guys like me, called We Agnostics. That most of us come here and we have a hard time with this, even no matter. And you know who? I've had the privilege to sponsor a couple of people over the years and meet some people that are in the clergy, and they have the hardest time of all. Another thing that, and probably the thing that made me feel the most separate from you, is that I would stop drinking and I would come into Alcoholics Anonymous and sit in the rooms of AA, and I would observe you. And what I saw so painfully clear is I saw a group of people who quit drinking and became happy, who quit drinking and seemed to fit, who quit drinking and laughed a lot and seemed to enjoy life. And I quit drinking and I didn't feel at all like you looked. I quit drinking and a hole would open up in me that was unbearable. I quit drinking and I felt like a fish out of water. Sobriety to me felt like I was doing time. And if you ever sat in a county jail waiting to get out, you know what it feels like to do time. There's an empty uselessness about it. And that's the way every time I'd stop drinking, that's what would happen to me. And I would look at you and I would come to the conclusion that whatever is wrong with you is not the same thing that is wrong with me, because you quit drinking and you feel and act and live differently than I'm capable of feeling, acting, and living. That there's something different wrong with me. And God knows I'm an alcoholic. I've been in prison. I've been arrested for DUIs, endless rehabs and detoxes. And I drank myself all the way to living like an animal on the streets, drinking cheap wine to survive. But there must be something else wrong with me besides alcohol. And people keep telling me, just put the plug in the jug. Just stop drinking. And I stopped drinking, and I can't stand it. And I didn't know that that's what it is to be an alcoholic. In the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it talks about the difference between the problem drinker and the real alcoholic. And it says something that's very interesting. It says the problem drinker drinks like us. And I've known guys like this. I've drank with guys like this. And the book says if a sufficient reason, falling in love, warnings from a doctor, a number of things. If your boss says if you get drunk one more time, you're going to lose your job. The wife says if you come home drunk one more time, I'm out of here. The problem drinker says to himself, you're right. I'm not going to do that anymore. And he doesn't. But the real alcoholic, we get to that point and we say to ourselves, my God, they're right, I'm dying. I'm going to lose everything. I'm never going to do that again. And we do. And then we say to ourselves, well, this time I really mean it. And I do it again and again, because lack of power is my dilemma. Silkworth, I love Dr. Silkworth. We owe such a tremendous debt to him. He says that guys like me, when we're dry, we're restless, irritable, and discontented unless I can again experience a sense of ease and comfort, which comes at once by taking a few drinks. And every time you take alcohol out of my life, that's the way I feel. For all practical purposes, my alcoholism experientially always started where the bottle ended. And it was always the emptiness of sobriety that would lead to the insanity of the first drink. The book calls it a spiritual malady. And I didn't understand that. I didn't know what was wrong with me. And I sat in meetings and I compared how I felt inside to how you looked outside, and I came up different. And if you do that, you can't help but come up different, because what I was doing is I was comparing where I sat with untreated alcoholism in a state of dryness to the outward manifestation of a program of recovery in your lives. And I came up different. I could come up nothing but different. Because I wasn't working any program. I was just going to a few meetings. You can go to PTA meetings that don't make you a parent. And you can go to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous and it doesn't make you a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's a lot of things involved here. There's a process in the book called the 12 Steps that gave you people the thing that I observed in you. But I thought you just got that way because you quit drinking. And I'll tell you what eventually happened to me in the years that I was in and out. I was offered Alcoholics Anonymous many times. I ended up in meetings many times. And I'm the kind of guy that I can go on a runner and lose everything. I could come out of a halfway house and have a good job and get an apartment and have a car and have some money in my pocket in a relationship and go on a runner and end up in the bushes with nothing. And that happened to me time and time again. And I would crawl back into Alcoholics Anonymous or into some halfway house or some detox, and I'll do anything to stay sober. Just lead me, tell me what. And unfortunately, if you're like I am, the first thing I get back after getting sober is my opinion. So I sit in meetings, and everybody in AA is trying to offer the program to me, and I'm judging what you're offering me, right? I remember one time, it was the year before I got sober. It was early 1978, a few months before I got sober. I was arrested for a felony DUI. They said it was a stolen car. Believe me, I borrowed it, but they have no sense of humor. I got in an accident, a hit and run, and I got arrested, and I was put in jail. And I went to court, and I was sentenced to 2 years in prison. And the judge stayed the commitment. He says, if you can find a long-term treatment center to go into, report to me back at the end of a year, and if your probation officer says you're doing well and you've been continuously sober for a year and you've paid back the court costs and the fines and the restitution and all that other stuff, we'll take a look at it, and maybe you won't have to go do the time. But if you don't uphold any of those conditions, you're gone. So I went into this Skid Row halfway house. It was the only place that would take me. I'd been in every other treatment center in that part of the state. And I'm dry a while, and I'm getting ready to drink. I started after a number of years know when it was coming, because I'd start to get that feeling that antsy feeling like I can't stand this anymore. And I would get it when nothing's wrong. And I'm restless, I'm irritable, and I'm discontented. And I don't know I couldn't have put those words on it, but I knew something was wrong. I got grave emotional problems. I don't know what they are, but I'm the kind of guy that I can sit in a chair and feel like I could go out and conquer the world, and within 3 minutes I want to commit suicide and nothing's happened. I don't know, I just go on this roller coaster ride. I got mental problems. My head is very quickly, just quick, talking to me all the time. Like chatter, and it's all negative stuff. Trying to live with my mind in early sobriety is like going cross-country in a van full of 8-year-olds that have overdosed on sugar and none of them like you, right? And it's all negative stuff. It's negative stuff. And I'm facing 2 years in prison, and I'm unemployable. I can't hold a job. I can get a job, but I can't hold a job because I'm so uncomfortable around people. I get on the muscle with them. I don't mean to do that. I just don't know how not to do it. And I grabbed this guy, this old-timer in AA, and I sit him down, and I said, I got to talk to somebody. And I took a risk. And I told him all about this stuff, about the 2 years in prison and the probation and the emotional stuff and the mental stuff and the homelessness and all the shame and guilt from all the people I'd hurt and what I did to my family and all that stuff. I says, I need help. I'm afraid I'm going to drink, getting ready to drink. I can tell it's coming. I can hold it off for a while, but I know it's coming. I said, what can I do? And he says, he points to this thing on the wall. He says, well, we have these 12 steps. Now, I don't know if you've ever looked at the 12 steps when you're at that point in your life. I mean, they don't match up. I mean, they don't match the problems. I mean, they're a nice set of altruistic kind of principles. I mean, if I ever got my life together, I'd probably do that. I might join the PTA or something. I don't know. But it doesn't seem to apply directly to my set of problems. I need a set of steps that says, step 1, make Bob's police record disappear, Step 2, make his family realize how wrong they'd been about him. Step 3, give him $3,000. Make his family come back, all this stuff, make him feel better. I needed but I look at this stuff and it doesn't seem to apply. First of all, it talks about God, and that makes me very uncomfortable. I'm not going to turn my will and my life over to God on a bet, because I know what he'll do to me. See, I still have an opinion about God. I'm not going to make restitution. I still have an opinion about restitution, and with all my problems, I'm not going to help anyone else. I have to work on me. So I sat with a judgment and I never did it. And I never did Alcoholics Anonymous. All I ever did was go to a few meetings and sit in here with untreated alcoholism waiting for the gift. And nothing ever happened. Now there are people who can do that, and I have one of my best friends did that for 7 years. Came here, sat here, was miserable in Alcoholics Anonymous for 7 years and never picked up a drink, and finally started working the steps, and now he's sober 20 years, and he's one of the most active members in my group. He's a great member of Alcoholics Anonymous. But I could never do that. I'm a wimp. I get too out of sorts, and I got to go seek relief. And I did that until coming off that run out of that Skid Row halfway house, I started hitchhiking cross country because I thought if I could get to California, maybe I could elude the police and I wouldn't have to go back and do the 2 years, and I could hide out. And if I could get to California where it's warm, maybe I could survive another winter on the streets. Because I almost froze to death the prior winter on the streets of Pittsburgh. I know what it's like to have to walk all night long because it's 10 or 20 degrees out, and if you sit down, you go to sleep and you freeze to death. So you walk, and you look for doorways, and you look for all that stuff. And I thought if I could get to California, maybe I'd have a chance. And I made it as far as Las Vegas, Nevada. And I got to the point that it talks about in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. In chapter 11, it says we get to a point where we can't imagine life with alcohol anymore, and we can't imagine life without it. We'll be at the jumping off place. We'll know loneliness such as few people do, and we'll wish for the end. And that's where I was at. I hadn't been able to drink successfully in a lot of years, but I kept going after it with the illusion that it's going to be like it was years ago. And it never was. And I don't know what it is about guys like me, but the reality is that once we cross over a certain line, alcohol stops being a treatment for alcoholism. And I say that because I believe from my experience that alcohol was a treatment for my alcoholism for a lot of years. I can remember in the early days of drinking that walking into a party and not knowing anybody and feeling like everybody's looking at you and you feel uncomfortable, or walking into a bar and you can't talk to anybody and you're uptight and you're locked up inside yourself, and 4 or 5 double shots of whiskey, I can talk to anybody about anything. Alcohol in the early days of drinking relieved me of the bondage of self. It allowed me to come outside myself and be a part of this world, the thing that I hungered for and wanted more than anything. But at the end of my drinking, that didn't happen. At the end of my drinking, if I was sitting in some Skid Row bar or on a park bench and I'm drinking a bottle of wine, I'm not the guy that's laughing and telling jokes and talking to the girls. I'm not the guy that's in the bar shooting pool. I'm the guy that's sitting on the end of the bar all by himself, drinking himself into oblivion, looking at the people that are having a good time, wondering, what's wrong with me? Because I could remember when I got the effects out of drinking that they were getting. I remembered the good days, and I yearned for them at a depth that is hard to describe. And in 1978, coming cross country in a van full of guys that I'd hitched a ride with, I finally confronted the reality of my situation. And I'd been drinking round the clock for a couple days, and one of the guys in the van, they're all alcoholics, he turns to me and he says, "What's wrong with you?" And he says that because I'm drinking and passing out and drinking, and I'm not laughing and carrying on with the other guys. I'm just sitting there like a bump on a log. And when he said that, I thought to myself, what's wrong with me? And all of a sudden, I could see very clearly that I had been this way, and this was the effects I was getting from drinking and had gotten in a long time. That it had probably been 2 years or maybe longer since I got out of alcohol what they were getting out of alcohol. And I finally knew the reality that I did not want to know. I knew the party was over. And it had been over. And there's nothing I can do to change that. And that was one of the most horrible realizations I ever had, because I felt stuck. Because I can't go on like this, and yet I can't stop drinking. You take alcohol out of my life, I can't stand it. I love W.C. Fields. He says, I was sober one time, it was the most boring 45 minutes of my life. And I feel like there's no choices here. I can't live sober and I can't get drunk right. I'm stuck. And the book says when we get to that point, we know a loneliness such as few do. We're at the jumping off place and we wish for the end. And I got out of that van in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I went and I found a policeman. And I asked him if he could tell me where I could get sober. And he directed me to the county hospital. And I had a bottle of Thunderbird with me, and I remember finishing that bottle of Thunderbird. No matter how sick I was, I couldn't pour it out. I mean, that's alcohol abuse. And walk into that hospital, and I checked in there, and they asked me something, 63 of the big book. And I was trying to act like I'd already gone through the steps in the first 2 weeks I was there, and she asked me about this prayer, and I remember she said page 63. And there came a time right before I was ready to be discharged from that hospital when all of a sudden I knew what was going to happen to me. I knew that when I got out of there I was going to drink again. And believe me, I didn't want to drink again. I really didn't want to drink again with everything in me. But I knew the truth. And the truth was that I don't have what it takes to not drink. I mean, I can put it off for a while. I can maybe put it off for a couple months. But I know what's going to happen. And I did something to this day I'm astounded I did, because I was an atheist. I opened the book to page 63, and there's a prayer on page 63. It's our third step prayer. It's the foundation of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I started to read that prayer, and I didn't understand it. In the middle of the prayer is a line that says, relieve me of the bondage of self. I read that line, and I threw that book across the room, and I started sobbing, and from the bottom of my heart I said, God, please help me. Because when I read that line, relieve me of the bondage of self, it became real clear that the reason I'm going to drink again, the reason I'm homeless, and the reason I'm on the run facing 2 years in prison, the reason my family won't talk to me, the reason I'm unemployable, the reason this time I might get the courage to kill myself is because of me. And I don't know how to get away from me. Everywhere I go, there I am. I spent years in the early 70s in therapy as a young kid under the supposition that if they could get them to make me think different and feel different, I could go out there in the world and act different. And it worked great until I left the group therapy room. Because I can't get away from me. There's nothing I could ever do that would change me inside. And I felt absolutely and utterly hopeless. And I said my first prayer. And something happened to me. I don't know if it was a spiritual experience. I don't know if it was just a surrender process. I don't know. But all of a sudden, a feeling came over me in the midst of all the insanity. Was a sense and a feeling that in Alcoholics Anonymous, things are going to be okay. If I just immerse myself in AA. Now, I'd been around Alcoholics Anonymous at that time for almost 7 years. And I'd been in and out. And there was one thing I observed in AA that I could not argue with, is that the people that got involved and immersed themselves in AA, their lives changed. And I couldn't argue with that. I didn't like it because I didn't like what you were. I didn't really know what you were. You seemed like a weird group of people. First of all, you're happy all the time. That makes me very uncomfortable. You're grateful I'm here. That makes me really uncomfortable. And you're just raw about everything. I used to go to meetings back in Pennsylvania, these discussion meetings, and every person that spoke was more grateful than the person who spoke before him. And I'd sit there, I'm not grateful for anything, right? To me, you guys seem like a cross between the Salvation Army and Amway. You know, it was just... But I didn't care anymore. I got to the point where I was opinionless. And that is a great place to be. It is the beginning of all spiritual growth. And I joined a group, a floating big book group of Alcoholics Anonymous. My sponsor was a member. I got him to be my sponsor when I was new. He was real active in Alcoholics Anonymous. He was on every committee. He had been delegate. He was sober a long time. I thought he was the king of Alcoholics Anonymous or something. And I joined the same group that he belonged to, and I joined that group because they carried meetings into hospitals and institutions. And I started becoming an active member of that group, and it's a big book study group. It's a group that's very serious about the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and not very serious about much of anything else. And there's a lot of laughter there. And they had something that I didn't know I wanted, but it was something I desperately knew I didn't have. And they seemed to laugh a lot and take life very lightly. And I'm one of those kind of guys, you take alcohol out of my life and things become very, very serious. I mean, it's heavy. Life is heavy. And I was tired of it being heavy. And they started to get me into the process in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'd been around AA for 7 years, and I never even knew that there was a process in that book. I thought the steps, you looked at the thing on the wall, figured out what that meant, and just did it. That's like trying to work the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous by what you see on the wall or by what you hear in meetings about the 12 steps is sort of like going to a restaurant where a lot of auto mechanics hang out and overhearing their conversations about fixing cars and then try to go fix your own car. And instead, I got with some people who knew how the process in the book worked, and they started spoon-feeding me this process and taking me through it. And it very slowly started to change my life. My sponsor for a long time had me focusing on that third step. He had me reading page 60 through 63 every day for a long period of time. And when I first started reading it, I started to see it was talking about these people who wanted to run the whole show. And they're real selfish and self-centered. And you know something? I could see how there were people in my group that were like that, you know? And I was dying to tell them. There's a line in the 12 by 12. It says that we always see our defects of character in others before we see them in ourselves. And that's what was happening. I couldn't see it in me yet. I am the kind of guy, it's very, very hard for me, even today sometimes, to see when something's wrong in my life, to look at it and see clearly what it is through self-examination. Because what I'm looking for, I'm looking with. But one day I'm reading it, I'm in the process of reading it, and I've been reading it every day for a long time. And I had one of those kind of days that some of us have in our first early sobriety, first several months of AA, where everybody's rubbing you the wrong way. You know, it's just like people in traffic or driving, you're in a hurry and they're going 10 miles under the speed limit, you know, and you want to run them off the road. At the time I was the secretary of an AA meeting, and I was supposed to meet a newcomer there, and I was late, and I get to the meeting, and I set up everything, and I'd had this hassle at the grocery store with a clerk because I'd gotten a beef with someone there, and I get to the meeting, and I set the literature up, and my newcomer's there, and I sit him over here, and I get the perfect person to chair the meeting, the person I know is going to give him the message I know he needs to hear. And I got him to read chapter 3 more about alcoholism, so I can sit there and watch the light bulbs go on in him. And the meeting starts, and somebody raises their hand, and he starts talking about drugs, and then somebody cuts him off, and it turned into one of those kind of meetings where the people are yelling at each other, and it was awful. It's like, I hate meetings like that. I just hate meetings like that. And I'm getting mad because my newcomer's not hearing what he's supposed to hear. So at the end of the meeting, I throw the literature in the case, and I just storm out of there. I'm going to quit Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm the only one anyway that really does anything here. I'm the only one that cares about these newcomers. Screw y'all. That's it. I'm done. I call my sponsor up and he says, read page 60 through 63 of the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous. And in a moment of extreme turmoil and a lot of pain and agitation, I saw for the first time what the real problem was, that it was me. And I was in that spot because I was running the universe. I was trying to play God, as it says in the book. And I had everything orchestrated and all set up, and I was running the show. And that what a beautiful, cherished moment that was for me. Because it was the beginning of a process where I started to look at what the real problem is. In the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, it says selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. The root. Underneath everything, underneath my resentments, underneath drinking, underneath everything, is that part of me that just wants to run the universe, that wants to play God. And if anything kept me from Alcoholics Anonymous and anything ever drives me out, it'll be that. And I remember in my early sobriety going to my sponsor with something happened to me after I did the 4th step. And it started to change the way I think, but in the period prior to the 4th step, I would sit in meetings and I'm good at noticing what's wrong with you. You know, I don't know if anybody's ever done that, but it just becomes real clear to me what's wrong with you. And I start getting these resentments towards people in AA. Oh, this guy sounds good, but I know he's cheating on his wife. And this guy with the Cadillac, he sounds so spiritual. He's a materialist. He's got me fooled. I'm not fooled. I know what he's all about. And this guy that sponsors 50 people, those are trophies. You can't fool me. He thinks he's in service. I know the real truth, right? And I started taking everybody's inventory, and I go to my sponsor with all these lists of people they're screwed up in work and in AA, and he'd say, you got to quit playing God. So, I'm not playing God. I'm reporting accurate information. Yeah. I couldn't see it. And very slowly I started to see that what I was doing is that I was about to destroy myself. I was sitting on a throne and I was judging my way right out of Alcoholics Anonymous. Right out of here. And God has been so good to me by putting people in my life and that continually bring me back to where I'm supposed to be at. There was a guy in my early sobriety named Billy, and Billy was one of the guys that I used to go out to coffee with at night after meetings. We'd go to Denny's, and we'd sit and talk for hours. There'd be 4 or 5 of us. And on a couple occasions, I'd told Billy a few things about myself that I'd never told anybody except my sponsor. Those things that we come into Alcoholics Anonymous with that we're so ashamed of. And I really liked him, and I told him about some of those things. And I went to a meeting one night. It was a late night meeting. And I saw Billy there, and I said, Billy, how you doing? It's good to see you. And he looked right through me. And he had this look on his face like, get away from me. Who are you? And they started the meeting, and I sat there, and I got angry because I knew what had happened. I knew he was pretending like he didn't care about those awful things I told him, but he did. And he didn't want to be around me, and I suspected that maybe because of the look on his face that maybe he told some people. And I got real paranoid that maybe he'd been talking about me in Alcoholics Anonymous. And by the end of the meeting, I'm ready to go over, and I'm going to let him have it. And I'm going to tell him what an SOB is and I'm going to really give it to him. Because I know what he's doing, and it's not right, and I'm angry. And the chairman of the meeting says, before we close, does anybody have a burning desire? And Billy raises his hand, and he tells the group that he just found out he had terminal cancer that day. And I sat there, and I was this close to making a real idiot out of myself. And it was like a postcard from God. Dear Bob, you don't know anything. Love God. And I've had situations throughout my sobriety like that. that remind me that I don't know. And the essence of the fourth step, the most powerful part of the fourth step for me is when I did, this was our course. When I had to get honest and humble enough with myself to put myself in the position of the people who had hurt me. And as the book says, we must realize how the people who had harmed us were perhaps like us, spiritually sick. But I never wanted to do that in my life because I get a sick pleasure out of the judgment. When you're insecure and you feel like you're not enough, and if you're like I am, I like to judge people under the illusion that it pumps me up. And it really never pumped me up. All it ever did was make me separate and alone. And I think the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous are designed to turn me into a person that's capable of loving other people. Something I never could do. I was so self-obsessed and self-absorbed, and the only contact I ever had was with people that I could take something from. And I came in here so alone and so separate, and through the process of this 12 steps, I very slowly started to implement some changes in myself and my perception of life that are actually very similar to the perceptions that alcohol altered in me. Because if I went into a bar and there was some guy in there I hated, and maybe he stole something from me. After 5 or 6 shots of whiskey, I could forgive him. Hey, I'm a big guy. I could forgive him. I could see how he could have done. I could have done the same thing. If I'll buy him a drink, he'll buy me a drink, it's fine. And Alcoholics Anonymous does the same thing. It allows me to take away the separation, the things that separate me from other people. I have a sponsor he's ruthless when it comes to following the directions in that book, and especially in the amends part. He wouldn't let me get away with anything. When I got up to my 8th and 9th step, the first very serious amends I had ever made was to my family, and I was a little over a year sober by the time they finally came out to Las Vegas, just to see Las Vegas, and also kind of skeptically look and see if I was really sober, because I'd called them so many times and told them I turned over a new leaf that they didn't believe it. And they saw that I really was sober, and I sat in a coffee shop with my mom and dad, and I told them that I'd owed my dad a lot of money, and I told him I wanted to start making payments. And I did exactly what my sponsor said. He says, you tell him this is what you can afford every month. I had a list of all my financial amends, and I had it broken down. I can afford this much on each one every month. And I told my dad, I'm going to start giving you so much money every month. And my dad took my mom's hand, I'll never forget this, and he held her hand, he patted it, and he smiled at her. It almost looked like he was going to start crying. And he said to me, he says, Rob, you don't owe us anything. We are just so happy that you're on the right track, that whatever this AA thing is, we're glad you're doing it. And just keep staying sober, and that's it. You don't owe us anything. I was elated. I remember leaving there and going to my sponsor's office, just on this cloud, thinking, this amends stuff's pretty good. I like this. I was thinking about some of the other financial amends I had to make. Maybe if I told them I was secretary at an AA group, maybe, they'd take me off the hook, And I get to my sponsor's office, I tell him the story. My dad says I don't have to pay him. My sponsor says, I don't care what your dad says. You owe him. You got to get even, not for him. You got to get even for you. So God put me in a position where I was a cashier in a store, department store. And I was in a position where I saw a lot of silver coins and old dollar bills and stuff would go through the register. My dad had one obsession. He was a coin collector. So I started every week buying out of the register all the money. And every once in a while, like a gold certificate would come through, a $100 bill. My boss would hold it, and when I got paid, he'd let me make payments on it. And it took me over 4 years to collect in face value the amount of money that I owed my dad. And I sent it to him in rare coins and old dollar bills because I knew he couldn't send it back. If I would have wrote him a check, he would have never cashed it, torn it up. But it would have been easier for him to send back that old money than it would be for an active alcoholic to give away a bottle of Jack Daniels. Right? And it was one of the greatest things I ever did. I think that there's a principle that what I do to others, I must get even with, or I'm going to do the same thing in a different way to me. And I think that if you're sober for a lot of years and you've bystepped step 8 and 9, and you're wondering why there's some things missing from your life, and maybe over the years you've had some great opportunities in your sobriety and they've turned to crap, I think that there's a principle that I cannot receive anything that I secretly know I don't deserve. And part of the process of the 9th step is for me to rub away the wreckage of my past so I can become a receiver, a worthy receiver of God's grace. It's not that God cares, but I can't accept it until I can accept it. And I'm so grateful that I had the sponsorship that I had. He wouldn't let me duck nothing. And I had a lot of amends that I could never make directly to people. I lived on the streets for a number of years, and I robbed a lot of people, and I hurt a lot of people that I don't even know who they are, nameless, faceless people. And my sponsor said, you can't make direct amends to those people. You don't even know who they are. What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to spend the rest of your life trying to help God's kids in order to rub away the wreckage. And you're going to get opportunities to give money to people that are down and out, that don't have any money, and give to charities and do that, and do 12-step work, and give of your time and buy people meals. And you're going to have to spend the rest of your life doing that, living that way in order to rub that out. And he said there's some other amends that you may not be able to make ever, or you may not be able to make for a long time, because you don't know where those people are. And it'll be up to God to put them in your life. And if he does, you got to be ready, and you got to watch for them, because you never know when they're going to be put there. And it's kind of like the story of the old timer in AA who's sitting in the park one day on a bench, and across the path on another bench is this punk rocker. And he's got a cone of blue hair that comes out like this, and a cone of hot pink hair that comes out like this, and a cone of yellow hair that comes out here. And the old timer's staring at him, and the punk rocker jumps up and runs over to him and shakes his fist at him and says, "What are you looking at, old man? You got a problem with the way I look?" And the old timer says, No, son. See, many years ago I was bad to drink, and one time when I was really, really drunk, I made love to a parrot, and I thought maybe you might be my son. You never know. And at 10 years sober, a guy that I owed an amends to dropped into my life out of nowhere. And it was a very simple amends. And out of that amends, I was given a tremendous gift. And you never know. I have never, and there might be people here that have never done the 9th step, and there's a lot of fear involved. That's why the 3rd step has to be there. You really have to be determined to turn your will and your life over to the care of God, to make it none of your business, your finances, everything. Because if you're like I am, in early sobriety, when I was making $3.25 an hour, and my sponsor, I'm living paycheck to paycheck, and he's got me sending people money that I really need much more than they need. And some of those people deserved what they got, I thought. But I didn't want to drink anymore, and I'd made a commitment to step 3, to do this deal. And I did the deal. And it's been such an incredible, incredible journey. I think sometimes my whole life is about step 9. It's how I actualize step 12 in my life. I belong to a home group that does a lot of hospital and institution work. And I do 2 meetings every week in this Skid Row detox. And it's such a blessing. I get to see the things that in regular meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, you never see. I get to see the guys that were sober 25 years, that came to Las Vegas on vacation and drank. And they'll never make it back to their home group because they never make it back. I get to see the guys that were from my home group and groups in Vegas that I knew that were sober 10 and 15 and 20 years that drank again. And I get to see what happens to them. And you go to the regular mainstream AA, you don't see them because they never make it there. And I see the insanity that's in them that makes it absolutely impossible for them to ever come back here and reconnect. And rarely one will be able to do that. And they're very blessed individuals. And I know that I believe with everything in me, if I have the same disease that they have, what can happen to me can happen to them. I've watched the guys judge themselves right out of Alcoholics Anonymous, right out of AA, until their disease had them exactly where it wanted them, listening to no one except themselves. And they miss the gift. And it doesn't matter how rich your life is. The dangerous time for people like me is not when I'm struggling and as a newcomer. I'm going to a lot of meetings then. It's once I got a couple $100,000 in the bank and a big house and everything's going my way. That's the time that alcoholism has the most ammunition to lull me into a state of complacency. Because what can happen to others can happen to me. And I'm not immune. I'm very, very lucky. Through God's grace and you people and some principles in this book, that as long as I do certain actions every day, I get to remain sober. Not by anything great that I've done, not by my own power. But if I do certain things in Alcoholics Anonymous, I remain a receiver of God's grace. And Alcoholics Anonymous is designed to allow me to be empty of me just enough, not completely, but just enough to allow God's grace into my life. And I was under the illusion for a lot of years that the answer had to come towards me. That I would be whole if I found the right person to love me, if I found the right kind of life, if I had the right kind of friends, if I was properly financed. And that has nothing to do with it. Alcoholism is not affected by how much you love me. It's affected by one thing and one thing only, about how I care about you. There's a guy that came down with me from Vegas. Is one of the guys I sponsored that God put in my life this last year. What a blessing. He was sober over 5 years. I'm going to commit suicide because he was sober on the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. How many times do we see that? How many times? There's a great fellowship here, but it's vastly more than that. There's a program of recovery here. And I got to watch him as I've watched hundreds of other people go through the process in the book and start to clean up the wreckage of the past and make the amends and sponsor other people and do service in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I watched the change. And I don't even know if he's been able to see it, but everybody in my home group has seen it. And if you're new, I beg of you to put aside everything you think and everything you feel for a set of actions and a fellowship that won't make any sense to you. Guaranteed. And just do it anyway. And if you were to poll 100 people in Alcoholics Anonymous sober over 5 years, you would get a lot of different opinions about what AA is to them and what it means and what it's about. But I think in almost every case you would find two things that would run consistently true with every one of those people. One is that Alcoholics Anonymous didn't make any sense to them and they didn't want to come here. And secondly, after coming here long enough and connecting with AA and doing this deal, They know it is the greatest thing that has ever happened to them. And before I close, I'm going to tell you a story. I've been telling it for a lot of years. I heard it in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's not original. I heard it probably 17 years ago. There's a guy and he has a day off. And he's sitting in his easy chair reading the newspaper. And he has a 6-year-old daughter. She says, "Daddy, please play with me." He says, "Not now, sweetheart. I can't. I'm reading the paper. Maybe later." She says, "Daddy, please play with me." He looks in the paper and there's an ad for an airlines. It's a full-page map of the world showing where the planes fly. And he gets an idea. He tears it out of the newspaper. He tears it up into little pieces. He gets a roll of Scotch tape. He says, "Sweetheart, here's a puzzle. It's a map of the world. Take it into your room, and I'll tell you what, if you can put it together, bring it back, and I'll play with you for the rest of the day." And he eases back in his chair, and he figures he's off the hook. She's 6 years old. She don't have a shot. 10 minutes later, she comes back, and it's taped together perfectly. And he says, "My God, sweetheart, how did you do that?" And she says, "It was easy, Daddy. On the back was a picture of a man. When I put the man together, the world kind of fell into place." And if you're new, please come with us. Grab the old-timers that are here in your community and follow their path, and you'll watch the most incredible thing you've ever seen. You'll see a world that you never fit in, that was hostile and very alien to you when you're sober, become a paradise. Thank you.